Welcome to a new episode of the China Horizons podcast series. My name is Cristina Bahón, researcher at the Center for East Asian Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain. Today's episode is part of our ongoing commitment to the China Horizons project, which aims to explore China's role in global development and its impact across different sectors. In this episode, we delve into the fascinating world of translation in the Chinese world, more specifically in Chinese politics in translation. Our guest today is Mario Santander, researcher at the Center for East Asian Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid, specialized in translation studies. His current research examines Xi Jinping's report, delivered last October 16, 2022, to the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. He has analyzed the official translations into English, French, and Spanish. Mario, welcome to this program.
Thanks for having me, Cristina. It's a pleasure to be here and share with everybody some of the work that our team has done.
Well, starting with the most basic, what do you think about translation in the Chinese world?
Translation is often given very little importance in Europe, less than in China. However, when we really want to be sure that our message arrives properly to an interlocutor who speaks Chinese, the role of a translator or an interpreter is much more relevant than we think. In many situations, translators or interpreters have a very difficult task, and many times very few people realize that there has been a bad translation. People believe that for doing a good translation, you only need someone who can speak well two languages, but that's not enough.
Yeah, can you please explain that more in detail, please?
Of course. Interpretation from European languages into Chinese have to be well prepared before it takes place. The structure of European languages and the structure of the Chinese language are very different, and the order of the information in the sentence has to be placed differently on most occasions. In addition, there are specific vocabularies that have to be prepared in advance.
So, do politicians and businessmen prepare their speeches before they have a meeting in China?
Well, we often see situations in which a European politician has expressed a complex or highly nuanced idea, which, when translated into Chinese, becomes quite simple. This is not always the fault of the translator, but rather because we are not aware of all the work involved in simultaneous translation. Simultaneous or even consecutive interpreters have a time limit for interpretation, and a complex brain mechanism occurs. Those who have done simultaneous interpretation know that after a while, one feels much more clumsy and the language is less fluent, because the ability to concentrate the brain simultaneously on two different languages is an extremely complex effort which causes enormous fatigue for the interpreter. In China, instead, it has been done a splendid job of training many translators and interpreters, but even among the best, very few are able to translate with all the nuances a politician's speech that has been improvised suddenly, unless it's only a matter of very short sentences and the politician speaks slowly. To ensure the success of a political meeting, as well as a business meeting, Chinese translators and interpreters are used to prepare their meetings in advance, to know what specialized vocabulary is going to be used, to clearly understand the perspective that wants to be transmitted by certain party, so as not to make mistakes in understanding that can be relatively serious.
Okay, so do you mean that the Chinese always prepare their translations or interpretations in advance?
The Chinese side, when it comes to first-level meetings, even second-level meetings, or even lower, always has something prepared and bring its own interpreters who know more or less what is going to be discussed at the meeting. This is essential. The preparation of the interpretation work is very important to ensure that a meeting is successful.
And what happens in case of the Europeans?
In Europe, very few are aware of this problem, and many politicians or diplomats, and even more businessmen, go there, give a long speech, and listen to the Chinese interpreter, convinced that without having prepared anything beforehand, he will be able to translate those phrases, often said at a breakneck speed. And I say Chinese interpreter because Europeans use a lot of interpreters from Chinese origin instead of European interpreters. This is what often happens in the field of interpretation and in meetings that have not been prepared.
Nevertheless, in China, many people speak English, and I suppose that discussion will be easier in this international language.
In general, businessmen consider that, well, if the Chinese side speaks English, everything is pretty much solved. It's true on many occasions. Chinese people learn English very well, but it's also true that on many occasions, because our English has various pronunciations, sometimes they do not quite understand what we have said. And in the Chinese culture context, they are not used to admit that they have not understood what someone said in English. Many times, messages have not been clearly received, and yet misunderstandings have occurred. In the case of European businessmen, of course, if they use a Chinese translator and if they have not prepared the speeches, if they have not spoken with such a translator, it's certainly very difficult for the message to reach the Chinese side, because there are specific vocabularies. It happens quite often, Cristina, that the translation is not good enough and don't have the nuances that the speaker wants to express. And sometimes it's difficult for a Chinese translator to discuss a proposal that could be considered non-profitable for the Chinese side. Due to their education, Chinese interpreters identify with their own country and have difficulties translating proposals that could be considered non-profitable for the Chinese side. These are problems that occur in interpretation, in spoken communication.
Yes, I see that the oral interpretation is really a complicated issue, but what happens in written translation? Could you please tell us something about your research on this field?
Yes, of course. Written translation is a difficult task that often goes unnoticed, but it's indispensable in many areas of the society. Translations have naturally played a crucial role in spreading the message of the Chinese government to the international community, and have largely determined the reception and understanding of that message by foreign audiences. In the case of Chinese institutional translations, the name of the translator or translators is usually not included in the text that is made public. However, there are remarkable differences when translating official reports of the Chinese Communist Party from Chinese into English, French, or Spanish, respectively, and this is what I have tried to understand in my research.
Could you give us some context and tell us a little more about the translation differences you mentioned?
Every 5 years, a major political event brings China, and especially its capital, Beijing, to a standstill: the Chinese Communist Party Congress. This Congress is one of the party's fundamental organs, which has governed the destiny of China since the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. The current functions of the Formation Congress include the election of the CCP Central Committee, the examination of reports and documents from lower-level CCP organs, and the making of decisions that will mark the destiny of the Asian giant for the next 5 years. The 20th Congress of the CCP was held in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing from October 16 to 22, 2022. A new Central Committee was elected, which in turn elected a new Standing Committee headed by Xi Jinping. The first day of the Congress, Xi Jinping delivered to the plenum a report. The original Chinese version and its translation into the official UN languages, Arabic, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, are available on the Chinese Foreign Ministry's website. While the original text and the translations are related in many respects, there are certain divergent nuances that are particularly striking. Thus, this research examines Xi Jinping's original Chinese version of the report to the 20th CCP Congress and its official translations into English, French, and Spanish, observing the similarities and differences. This reveals different nuances of Xi Jinping's message depending on the language used, which could be interpreted in relation to China's foreign policy.
If I understand well, you mean that a translation can express certain political attitude, is that right?
Translation is inevitably a process of approachment between cultures, although when translating original texts written in Chinese into other languages, the translator should not only transfer the words from one language to another with a very different culture, but also convey the message, implicit or explicit, that the CCP, and in this case its leader, wants to spread to the rest of the world. Translation can also become a political act that expresses a certain ideology. There are differences in Xi's messages in different languages, which could well be interpreted as different patterns of CCP projection to the international arena. Deciphering these messages properly will be key to understanding what China really wants to convey to English, French, and Spanish-speaking countries.
Is it really so important to understand the relevance of the General Secretary's speech at this plenary session in Chinese politics and the role that translations of this speech play in the international dissemination of the CCP's ideology?
The dissemination of the General Secretary's speech is a common practice of party propaganda, with a special meaning in Chinese politics. But in addition to being published in Chinese, translations plays a crucial role in its international dissemination. Obviously, translation also becomes a political act that expresses a certain ideology. Since the founding of the CCP in 1921 and the People's Republic of China in 1949, the translation of political texts in the Asian giant ceased to be an individual act and became part of an institutional translation policy. On the other hand, it should be noted that there are notable differences between the messages addressed to the Chinese people and the speeches given to international audiences by Xi Jinping.
So, what strategies did the translators use depending on the recipient's country? What similarities and differences can be seen between the English, French, and Spanish translations? And what message could the Chinese Communist Party be trying to convey to the recipient countries with these nuances?
Let's see various examples of the use of terms and expressions from the political, economic, and social areas presented in the English, French, and Spanish versions of Xi Jinping's speech. In order to distinguish the similarities and differences between them, examine what kind of strategies the translators used depending on the recipient country, and try to deduce something more from the CCP's message to those countries. Political scientists specializing in China pay close attention to the use of one or another term and their analysis is crucial to understanding what's hidden behind a certain political discourse. Given the impossibility of knowing the internal discussions through other, more open means, the study of the terminology used in an important speech, the emphasis of one or another term, and its frequency of use is one of the thermometers used to interpret the Chinese political situation. Let me give you an example, Cristina. The Chinese term 国家 has more than one meaning. Strictly speaking, it means country, referring to the territory that makes up a familiar unit, but it's also used to mean nation and state. In Xi Jinping's speech, the translations of 党和国家 in the English and Spanish versions, it has been decided to translate it as the party and the country. In Spanish, el partido y el país, while the French version chooses to translate 国家 as l'État, that is, du parti et de l'État. In fact, during centuries, in the Chinese Empire, there was a strong state with an administration of literary bureaucrats. China was a country with a centralized power. Therefore, probably the translation of state fits well with the Chinese original intention of the use of the term. In any case, it's an expression of the identification of the party and the state in the Chinese political system. Nation-states are a contemporary construction, and in Western countries we make a clearer distinction between the terms country and state. Nevertheless, it's important to note this lack of concretion of the Chinese language that appears in different translations of this speech. The same is true for other terms, such as party, 党, government, 政府, motherland, 祖国, and nationality or ethnic minority, 民族, whose use in the various translations of Xi's speech is not homogeneous. These terms cannot always be considered synonyms in the three translations, which highlights their ambiguity of meaning. The quality of the translations of Xi Jinping's speech in its different versions not only have a value per se, but they also project a certain vision.
In fact, it even seems that for French and Spanish audiences, the translations are more literal and probably less accurate than the English one. Am I right, Mario?
It could be said that way, but that is not all the picture we can get from the different translations. A very interesting example, Cristina, is that as of very specific political expressions that when translated literally are completely impossible to understand without an explanation. In Xi's speech, he refers to certain animals, tigers, flies, and foxes. In context, he used these expressions in Chinese. 打虎, 白鹰, 猎虎, 多管齐下. And the official English translation says, we have used a combination of measures to take out tigers, swat flies, and hunt down foxes. Same for the French translation. Adopter une approche multidimensionnelle pour réprimer aussi bien le tigre que le mouche et le renard. And also in Spanish. Adopción simultánea de diversas medidas. La caza del tigre, el trompazo a la mosca, y la captura del zorro.
And what does Xi Jinping really mean with these expressions?
Xi Jinping refers to one of the policies that were enormously popular when he rose to the top of the party, his campaigns to fight corruption. In this case, the three translations do not represent substantial differences. The choice was made to preserve the metaphor of the original text, and a literal translation from Chinese is made without any explanatory note. Undoubtedly, for a reader not familiar with Chinese political culture, it's difficult to understand what is being referred to by the mention of different types of animals. In fact, tigers refer to high-level officials, flies to low-level officials, and foxes to those officials who fled abroad. In all three cases, they are referring to officials suspected or implicated in corruption cases. The tiger in Chinese culture and in the horoscope is a highly respected animal, characterized by its strength. However, the fly is an insignificant and small insect, while the fox is considered one of the fastest animals on the planet and is distinguished by its cunning. Through this subtle metaphor, she is emphasizing that, regardless of the official level, high, middle, or low, and where they are, all corrupt officials will be hunted down and condemned, without any distinction between them.
And how do you interpret the fact that it is not explained the meaning of these animals in the political speech?
The fact, Cristina, that all use a literal translation of the original text in Chinese, combining metaphorical language to talk about the problem of corruption, can have several interpretations. The first is that this part of the speech is considered to be primarily directed at an internal audience, so it's not necessary for it to be understood by those who speak other languages. In fact, Xi Jinping's legitimacy during his first term in office from 2012 was reinforced by the launch of broad anti-corruption campaigns, which were very well received by a large part of the population. No doubt, anti-corruption campaigns serve also to smooth his path further, by facilitating the elimination of potential political opponents in this way. The second interpretation would be that it's about avoiding, as far as possible, the dissemination of this negative aspect of Chinese internal politics in the international arena.
Well, all these nuances in the translation of political aspects are really insightful and interesting. Mario, what happens in the translation of economic terms in Xi Jinping's speech?
The translation of numbers and units of measurement have always been a point that has even led to some confusion in economic negotiations. It's difficult to translate numbers or units of measurement. It's not unusual to write down numbers in a conversation since the different Chinese expressions are difficult to interpret simultaneously without making a mistake. Since in Chinese there are several expressions for high numbers, like 1 for 10,000 or yi for 100 million. In addition, in Chinese there are various units of measurement that do not have an exact equivalent in other Western languages. This is the case, for example, of yi mu, 666.7 square meters. When translating this unit of measurement into English, French, and Spanish, the three translators have employed different strategies. The English translator completely domesticates the text and adapts it to a unit of measurement that is comprehensible to the English-speaking public. It said 100 million hectares. For his part, the Spanish translator completely foreignizes the text and maintains the original unit of measurement, just using mu, the original Chinese word, which is unintelligible to a Spanish-speaking reader. Finally, the French translator preserved the Chinese unit of measurement, but includes an explanation suitable for the French-speaking public.
Are there other terms that makes difficult to understand the speech?
There is a passage referring to the characteristics on which the CCP's social governance system should be based. In Chinese, 共建,共治,共享. The translation of this terminology entails a certain difficulty, since in all three terms has been used a common Chinese compound term with the prefix 共, literally co, together, or share, depending on the context, while in the three European languages under analysis, it's not so common the use of these compounds. In this case, the English and French translators opt for an explanatory translation, that is, collaboration, participation, and shared benefits in English, and concertation, synergie et partage in French, while the Spanish greatly foreignizes the target text, creating three terms identical to the Chinese but are not frequently used in Spanish or are even given a very different meaning than that which seems to be intended in the Spanish translation. That is, la coedificación, la coadministración y el codisfrute. In addition to these three terms, co-construction, co-administration, and co-enjoyment, throughout the Spanish translation of Xi's report, there appear some invented words such as mercadizar, simultaneación, codeliberación, irrelajada, or invacilantes, just to mention some of them.
Well, Mario, those terms probably show us some cultural and linguistic differences between European countries and China. China is a country with a long history, a rich cultural tradition, and a very interesting language.
That's true, Cristina. Let me point out a last example. There is a long passage containing numerous idioms or set phrases that, as I mentioned above, are very common in Chinese culture and political propaganda. Most of these idioms used by Xi have their origin in classical Chinese literature, and their meaning usually transcends their literal sense. So for a correct understanding of them, it's necessary to have some historical and cultural knowledge of ancient China. Today, some of these idioms are frequently used by Xi or other members of the CCP to root the power of the party in classical tradition. Some of these Chinese expressions have an equivalent in Western culture. For example, 112, literally 1 plus stone plus 2 plus bears, translated as kill 2 bears with 1 stone. And they share both the same literal and metaphorical meaning. However, a large majority of the fixed expressions are closely linked to traditional Chinese culture, and it's an impossible mission to find an appropriate equivalent in another language, as this. There is a 10 set phrases in a row that Xi uses in one paragraph of his speech that attest this. In Chinese, it said, 天下为公，民为邦本，为正宜德，可固定心，人人为贤，天人合一，自强不息，厚德载物，将心修睦，亲人善邻等. These are translated in English as pursuing common good for all, regarding the people as the foundation of the state, governing by virtue, discarding the outdated in favor of the new, selecting officials on the basis of merit, promoting harmony between humanity and nature, ceaselessly pursuing self-improvement, embracing the world with virtue, acting in good faith and being friendly to others, and fostering neighborliness. Translating these 10 expressions into English, French, and Spanish is a very difficult task for everyone, Cristina. While in English and French an attempt has been made to facilitate the reading of the text, explaining the meaning of each of the idiomatic expressions, in the Spanish version, a literalization has been chosen that, in addition to reducing its effectiveness, causes the reader to be incomprehensible.
Well, Mario, probably very few specialists know that depending on the language in translation, their analysis of Xi Jinping's speeches could be influenced by the different strategies used for translation in different languages.
That's right. You are totally right. Overall, the comparative analysis reveals that the most domesticated and adapted text is the English one, while the most foreignized and which uses more literal and sometimes even incomprehensible expressions is the Spanish one. The English version is the one that best tries to explain the original message and has numerous additional clarifications in the body of the text itself or in footnotes to the most complex terms of Chinese politics, amplifying the original message on certain occasions. It uses fluid and modern English to almost perfectly translate the syntactical structure and the meaning of the original speech in Chinese. For its part, the French translation occupies an intermediate position in terms of translation strategies, frequently including an explanation of some political terms in brackets. It is fully adapted to the French-speaking public through the use of fully French semantic, syntactical, and grammatical expressions, which in certain cases entails a certain simplification and distancing from some nuances of the original in Chinese. Finally, the Spanish translators completely ignore the complexity of the terms for a Spanish-speaking reader and advocate a literal translation, which results in a text that is not very fluid, lexically cynicized, and difficult for Spanish speakers to understand. The translation is overly intertwined with literal Chinese structures and content, making it impossible to fully understand the message it wants to convey.
And Mario, how do you understand these differences?
I think, Cristina, that the numerous explanatory notes and terminological amplification in the English translation show the importance that the CCP attaches to a broader and more in-depth dissemination of its message among English-speaking readers, although it's worth remembering that these additional notes are only used to clarify positive terms or principles. For negative concepts or issues, such as corruption, a literal translation is chosen, which naturally also makes it difficult for English-speaking readers to understand the message. Although the messages conveyed in English, French, and Spanish are slightly different, the global importance that the CCP in general and Xi Jinping in particular attached to spreading their messages abroad should not be overlooked. But the importance attached to make their message resonate in the US, the UK, and Australia, to mention some English-speaking countries relevant on the international scene, is striking. On the other hand, the concern for the comprehension of political discourse in Spanish-speaking countries is evidently much less relevant to China's foreign policy. The next few years, Cristina, will be crucial to see the changes in the party-state policies and to see whether or not the institutional translations of CCP reports into different languages are affected by these changes.
Thank you so much, Mario. This has been an incredibly insightful discussion on the importance of translation in general and its influence on Chinese politics and the Chinese world in particular. We will definitely keep an eye on how this situation evolves and how the work of translators continues to influence the reception of Xi Jinping's speeches in different countries around the world. Many thanks also to all the listeners and friends of the China Horizons project. You can follow us on social media and visit our website chinahorizons.eu for more information on podcasts, policy briefings, journal articles, and much more. Thanks a lot for listening this podcast. The content of Xi Jinping's speeches, different languages, different messages, is a podcast based on the research work of Mario Santander, edited by Mario Santander and Tatiana Fisac, and recorded with the help of Cristina Bahón. All three are researchers at the Center for East Asian Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain, and research members of Dealing with a Resurgent China, DUARC project. Thank you.